Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy and specifically to talk about Russian oil and its use of the shadow fleet. Now, if you follow the channel, you'll be aware that because of the price caps that were put into place shortly after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they were set at $60 per barrel for crude oil and around about $100 per barrel for refined oil products. And the way that the West was looking to impose the price caps was through the ownership and insurance system that was in place at that time, because the West dominated the industry. They owned most of the vessels, so companies would lease them from some of the big shipping companies, and then they also provided the insurance. So the idea was that the West would be able to check exactly what all of these tankers were carrying through this ownership system. However, Russia has avoided that by using a fleet of shadow tankers, as they've been called. So these are tankers that are not officially registered with Russia. They might be registered with other countries, and they're not declaring actually what they're carrying. They're not telling anybody what prices have been paid. And so the navies around the world from the West are now trying to patrol the waters and intercept ships that they believe are shadow tankers carrying Russian oil. And in a recent incident in Estonia, which you can see the video for here, whereby you can see the tanker itself and the Estonian Navy fighter ship, which is trying to intercept it, they actually tried to board the ship. However, they were unsuccessful. You can hear some audio here of the Estonian Navy actually speaking to the ship itself.
This is Estonian warship Papa 6732. Your request will be denied. Follow my instructions. Alter your course to 105 immediately. Over.
Now, interestingly, they didn't comply with that, and a Russian fighter jet then appeared over the seas. So this was actually an incident whereby Russia was protecting the shadow fleet using its own air force. And in a recent post on X, Margarita Simonya, head of Russia's state media outlet RT, who posted that video we've just seen, said the jet was a Russian Su-35 sent to protect the vessel's seizure. And Kremlin aide Nikolai Patrushev told the Kommersant newspaper last month that Russia's navy was ready to protect its ships. He said, "Hotheads in London or Brussels need to understand this clearly," adding that Western efforts to block Russian ships was beginning to resemble a naval blockade. And I think this military intervention is really quite interesting because a lot of things have happened over the last few months that have really damaged the amount of income that Russia is receiving. Now, before we go on any further today, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, Incogni. One of the things that drives me crazy is spam marketing, whether it be text messages, emails, or my personal pet hate, phone calls. People ringing you up trying to sell you things that you literally don't want. And the reason why you're getting more and more of this is because of data brokers. They can take your personal information and sell it on the internet. So the problem you've got is, how do you stop these data brokers from selling your information? Well, you can actually contact them all individually and ask them to take you off their database. But who's got the time for that? Well, the answer to that is Incogni. Once you sign up with Incogni, they will contact all of the data brokers on your behalf and remove you from their databases. And the great thing is that they'll also protect you from identity theft and cybercrime. And the great news is that you can get a 60% discount off an annual plan, which is what I use, by going to incogni.com/Joe Blogs or clicking in the link in the description below. And the main thing that's caused Russian revenue to crash is the fall in oil prices. This chart shows the movement in the Urals crude oil price dating back to the start of 2022. And you can see that at that time, Russia was selling its oil for around $85 per barrel. That spiked to around $100 per barrel immediately following the invasion of Ukraine, because there was a global supply shock and prices globally increased, and that pulled up the price of Russian oil. But as you can see, over the past 3 years, there has been a general decline in Russian oil prices. And most recently, it was reported that the price had fallen to $50 per barrel, which interestingly, as I've marked on this chart, is below the $60 per barrel price cap that's been set by the West. So actually, prices have come to such a level now that the price cap is redundant as it sits at the moment, which is an interesting discussion, because the price cap has been put in place to really encourage Russia to come around the table and agree some sort of settlement, some sort of deal with what's going on in Ukraine. But clearly, if that price cap is now above what Russia is selling its oil for in the open market, it's completely ineffective. So the West will need to consider, if oil prices remain low, whether or not they reduce the oil price cap to maybe $50 or $40 or $30. A lot of people are saying that if they'd have set this price cap at $30, it would have encouraged Russia to actually come around the table quicker. But all of this really, the question on whether or not the price cap can be effectively controlled really relates to what's going on with the shadow fleet itself. Because if Russia is able to continue selling its oil without any interference from the West, then clearly the price cap is a waste of time. And this chart shows the increase in the recorded instances of shadow fleet tankers over the past 3 years. So you can see that 3 years ago, it was estimated that there were around 100 of these shadow fleet tankers regularly moving Russian oil. So these were tankers basically that were either flying the flag of Russia or not flying any flag, or flying other countries' flags and not declaring that they were moving Russian oil. But over the past 3 years, we've seen a rapid increase. And this is just the known shadow tankers. So this has been put together by the Brooklands Research Centre, and they say that there are now 330 of these tankers that they've recorded. I've seen reports that there might be over 1,000 of these tankers, but these are ones that they've traced, and they can actually say they are moving Russian oil. So there's been a rapid increase in the number. And if you look at the split of which countries they're coming from, it's interesting to note that there is the green section here on this bar chart shows those ships that are registered to Russia. So you can see that back in 2022, there were around 40 ships registered to Russia out of the 100 roughly. Now there's been an increase in that, but it certainly isn't the biggest increase. So today we're looking at over 100 of those ships being registered in Russia. But the vast majority of the ships, the increase is coming from other countries. So you can see we've got different colours here. The blue section at the bottom is Greece. There's been a significant increase of ships registered in Greece. And Greece is a big shipping nation. Lots of ships are registered there. So it's not unusual for these ships to actually be registered in Greece. This isn't Greece supporting Russia particularly. It's just that the shipping industry is structured so that Greece is a big player. We've got other countries in Europe in red, of which there's been a significant increase. We've then got Russia and then the rest of the world. And you can see that there's a wide spread. And the ship that we just looked at, that Estonia was trying to intercept, the Jaguar, was actually registered in Gabon in Africa. So not a country that you would normally associate with big shipping things, but that's where that ship was actually registered. Now, interestingly, we have a look at this chart. You can see that the sanctions that are being applied against these ships actually aren't a wholesale sanction. They're not applying against all of the different ships. The blue bar charts here, you can see, show the sanctions that have been put in place against these shadow tankers. So you can see that they're not actually covered all of them. So all of these tankers have not been sanctioned yet, which seems a bit bizarre. If these ships have been identified as operating as shadow tankers, you would have thought that automatically they would all be sanctioned. They haven't been. And also what you can see here is that different countries have applied sanctions against different ships. It's not universal. So the section at the bottom here shows the USA sanctions. So they came in towards the end of 2023. A small number of ships were identified at that point, and that's increased over the past 18 months. But other countries have individually sanctioned things. So the UK is the yellow section. They've sanctioned certain ships, and you can see the blue line isn't around that yellow section. So these are ships that the USA haven't sanctioned, but the US has. And it's the same for the EU. They've identified other ships that are not being sanctioned by the UK or the US. So the reason for showing you this chart was really just to show that it's a bit of a mess at the moment. It's a bit of a mixed bag in terms of which ships have been identified and which have been sanctioned. And not, as I said, not all of them have. There's a huge white gap here between the bar chart and the line chart, which tells us that there's certain ships that are still sailing backwards and forwards, moving Russian oil, that don't face any sanctions. So therefore, they're not going to be intercepted because they're not even on the list. And in terms of which countries have sanctioned the most, you can see that the USA has 32% of all of the ships that it's sanctioned that nobody else has. The EU 5%, the UK 14%, the US and the EU 14%. So again, the reason for showing you this is just to show there isn't a coordinated effort here. We're not sitting down and working out these are all of the ships, everybody now apply sanctions together. This is individual countries doing things without talking to anybody else. So I don't think this looks like a very well coordinated effort so far. Now, in terms of how effective these sanctions are, what is the West doing to actually stop those ships when it's moving Russian oil? This list shows the recorded instances of ships actually being stopped and detained successfully dating back to the middle of 2024. And as you can see, there is only a small number of vessels that are recorded here. I would have expected, if we are talking about sanctions, that this list would have been absolutely huge, because it's been reported that the shadow fleet is moving around 1.5 million barrels of oil per day. So that is a lot of ships moving a lot of oil every single day. So with ships, you can track them, you know where they're moving. So even if they turn their transponder off, which is quite common for these shadow fleets, they don't want anybody to know where they are, you can still plot that ship. Lots of people have radar and systems that will be able to tell you where these ships are moving. So it's not that difficult to be able to identify an oil tanker that's moving from Russia to somewhere else, either to China or India would be the usual destinations. So I would have expected this list to actually be exhaustive, to be really, really long. But as you can see, there's only a small number of vessels on here. And if we have a look at what's actually happened, the Jaguar incident that we've just talked about, we saw the video for it earlier. It was escorted out of Estonian waters by the Estonian Navy after that Russian fighter jet appeared in the skies above it. Now, the fighter jet didn't engage with the Estonian Navy, so there wasn't a standoff, but it was an implied threat, I think. When you've got a fighter jet suddenly appearing when you're challenging whether or not a ship should be in your waters, that tells somebody that something is going on there. That is a warning signal. The next one here on the list in April was the Koala, which was actually in the Gulf of Finland near Tallinn in Estonia. So once again, Estonia was involved. And that ship was actually detained and boarded by the Estonian Navy and released 2 weeks later following temporary registration somewhere else. So they stopped it for 2 weeks and then released it. So again, nobody got arrested. They didn't seize the oil. They just held onto it for a while. And the only other incident that's been recorded in 2025, and we're 5 months into 2025 now, was in January in the Baltic Sea near Germany. The ship was sailing under a Panama flag and was found adrift with 99,000 tons of Russian oil, which was suspected sanctions evasion. And that was towed to a harbour by German authorities. The cargo was seized and the vessel detained. But there's not many instances like that. We've got some other ones in 2024 all across the world. But I think it's strange that the West isn't really policing this particularly well. It's not really acting as a major deterrent if nobody is being stopped. Now, in terms of what's going on with Russia's revenue, whether or not Russia is still making a huge amount of money, this chart shows the total revenue that Russia is earning from its fossil fuel sales dating back to the start of 2022. And if you follow the channel, you'll know that we've looked at charts like this previously. We've got a split here into the different types of fossil fuel. At the bottom, we've got seaborne crude oil, which is what we're talking about in today's video. This is the oil that's being moved by tankers, some of which is the shadow fleet. We've then got a lighter purple, pink section, whatever you want to call it, which is oil being moved by pipelines. That's oil predominantly going to China now. Some of it is still going to landlocked countries in the EU, the European Union. We've then got a red section, which are seaborne oil products. So they are refined oil products like gasoline, kerosene, diesel, those sort of things. So again, that is something that will be moved by the shadow fleet. And then we have pipeline gas shown by the brown section, LNG shown by the lighter brown section, and then coal at the top. So you can see that the majority of the income More than two-thirds, almost three-quarters of Russia's income is coming from oil sales. So gas was a big part of the split. If you look back in 2022, you can see the brown section, the pipeline gas income was quite significant at that point. However, because of the sanctions being put in place by the EU, who've now all stopped buying Russian gas mostly, and things like the explosions in the Nord Stream pipelines, which obviously got destroyed and so not operational anymore, Russia's sale of gas has dropped significantly. So Russia is still receiving most of its revenue from oil. And if you look at the movement of this, if you look at the bottom three section, the purple, the lilac, and the red section, you can see that it undulates quite a lot between the start of 2022, when Russia was earning somewhere around 650 million euros per day, so about $700 million. If we look at where that's sitting now, it's down to around 500 million euros per day. So that's a significant fall over the past 3 and a bit years. But the total income is down significantly because it's lost all of that gas income. So total income is now down to somewhere around 650 million euros per day, compared with a peak of almost 1,200 in March 2022. So the income is down around 50%, but Russia is still earning a significant amount of income from its oil sales. And in terms of who's buying all of these products, it won't be a major surprise to see that the two biggest purchasers are China and India. China is still the biggest purchaser. It's buying mostly crude oil, the blue section here. It is also buying some oil products and pipeline gas, LNG, and coal. So it's buying everything from Russia, all of its different offerings. And it's buying somewhere in the region of 6 billion euros per month from Russia at the moment. India is buying around 4 billion, but you can see that the split of that, it's mostly crude oil. It's buying some oil products, not many. And the reason why China and India is buying so much crude oil is because they have their own refinery processes. They've got big refineries, so they can convert the crude into all of the finished products. And interestingly, in a video I recently posted, I was talking about the fact that India is now selling a lot of refined oil, so gasoline and diesel, to the UK. And a lot of that oil will have been made using Russian crude. So Britain is buying products that are being made using this Russian crude. So again, it's another way of avoiding the sanctions. Britain's not directly buying any crude oil from Russia or any oil products, but it is buying second-hand Russian oil that's going through the Indian refinery processes. Turkey's the third largest purchaser, purchasing around 2 billion euros per day. But you can see it's mostly buying oil products. The red section is the biggest section for Turkey. It doesn't have a massive oil refinery process itself. And then we've got the EU is still buying around 1.5 billion euros worth of products from Russia. Now, that's probably a surprise to some people because the EU has been at the forefront of the sanctions. It's been trying to force Russia to stop the war in Ukraine. But for a lot of countries, it just isn't economically viable for them to stop buying from Russia. It's going to be very expensive. So the biggest section here is LNG, which again is a surprise because you would have thought the EU could buy it from alternative providers, but there hasn't been enough LNG produced to meet the demand for all of these new LNG facilities that has been set up in Europe. So Russia is still earning close to €1 billion per day from the EU for LNG sales, as well as some pipeline gas and some crude oil. And then Brazil is number 5 on this list. And if we just go back to the chart looking at the price of Russian crude, I think it's interesting because the price cap is now ineffective. It's now set at a level above where Russia is selling its crude oil. And if oil prices continue to remain in the doldrums over the course of 2025, we've had a lot of uncertainty recently, so oil prices have come down significantly. But if it continues to be at or around $50, then we can forget about the price cap because you can't apply something that is above the current trading level. But in terms of trying to police that shadow fleet, it seems that the West isn't very effective. It's not put procedures in place. It doesn't have a coordinated effort, as we saw from earlier, in terms of some countries have sanctioned certain ships and others haven't. And it doesn't seem to have a coordinated effort in terms of policing the waters, taking action, and then what happens with those ships. So I wanted to post this video because I thought it was interesting that Estonia had intercepted or tried to intercept this ship, and then Russia basically strong armed them out of it. They came along and said, well, they flew their fighter jet over the sea, and then that ship was just escorted back to Russian waters. But it's an interesting conundrum as to how does the West fix this problem. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think what's happening with oil, particularly Russian oil that's being moved by the shadow fleet, is really quite an interesting topic, because when the price caps were announced back in 2022, it looked like it was going to be the masterstroke from the USA and Europe to really close down Russia's income, because as we saw from the tables earlier, Russia is earning the vast majority of its income from selling oil overseas, and most of that oil is being moved on ships and tankers. But I think the flaw in the price cap concept was that the idea was that the West owned all of the shipping, it owned a lot of the actual vessels, and it provided insurance for around 90% of the market. So the idea was that through those ownership systems, they would be able to see exactly what was being moved on those ships, and then if it was coming in at more than $60 per barrel, they would be able to shut it down and stop those companies from actually doing any business. But what we've seen in today's video is that the shadow fleet that has been developed by Russia over the past 3 years has proved to be effective in terms of avoiding those sanctions, because those ships aren't declaring what they're carrying, they're not declaring how much the oil has been paid for, who's actually buying it, where it's going. In many instances, those ships are doing ship-to-ship transfers. So basically, they will sail full of Russian oil, and then they will meet another ship somewhere in the ocean and then transfer the oil from one to the next. And then that second ship can then sail to the destination port, and it won't be seen to have come from Russia. So it's one way of avoiding the sanctions. The other reason why the shadow fleet is so effective in terms of how it's been built up so quickly is that Russia is using older ships. So a lot of the shadow fleet is over 15 to 20 years old, which for a lot of the older companies, they wouldn't use them. They would be putting them out of service, making them redundant. But they're now being picked up by lots of other operators and used to move all this Russian oil. So it's grown hugely over the last 3 years, the shadow fleet. And policing that shadow fleet is proving to be very difficult for the West, because firstly, they don't exactly know what's on board those ships. And then secondly, you actually have to go and intercept the ship and then take it into a port and arrest it. And as we saw from the table earlier, there haven't really been many recorded instances of that happening, only 4 so far in 2025. And as I said, it's estimated that the shadow fleet is moving over 1 million barrels per day. And we've got hundreds of these ships that are constantly sailing backwards and forwards. So when you think about the scale of this, there could be 1,000 of these shadow fleet tankers. That's the estimate that I've seen in some situations. There could be 1,000 of them sailing constantly backwards and forwards. Over the course of 2025, only 4 ships have been detained. So that tells me that the policing simply isn't working. So Russia is still able to move its oil to places like China and India. And so this system hasn't really been effective. Now, I reported in a recent video that the Donald Trump administration is threatening Russia, well, threatening India and China predominantly, with 500% tariffs if they're seen to be buying Russian oil. That's the threat that's been put to Russia unless it agrees some form of ceasefire in Ukraine. And when you think about that, that is a much more effective way of managing what's happening with Russian oil, because you don't have to bother trying to intercept the ships. You don't have to keep track of all of those different vessels. You just need to look at India and China and prove that they've bought any oil from Russia. And if they have, then they will face 500% sanctions. So basically what that would do, it would kill all of the export business to the USA for India and China. And that is one of the biggest markets for both of those countries. It's certainly the biggest market for China. It was over $440 billion in 2024. So when you look at the sanctions like that, that looks like an effective proposal. You think, yeah, that would actually work, because it would be relatively easy to prove that India and China had bought some oil, and therefore you could apply the sanction. Job done. trying to do what they've been doing over the past 3 years, intercept ships, keep track of what's going on, trying to look at what price has been paid for the oil, whether or not some of it was transport costs or whatever it might be. Really difficult to manage, really difficult to control, and very difficult to police. So the overall summary of today's video is that the shadow fleet that's grown up over the past 3 years has proved to be effective for Russia in terms of moving oil. It's still moving over 1 million barrels per day through all of these means to places like China and India. However, the fall in the price of oil is now proving a major problem for Russia because it's seeing its income drop dramatically as a result of lower revenue. The price caps are actually now redundant with the current prices. They're ineffective, so they need to be revised and maybe reduced if they're going to still be in place going forward. But unfortunately, from the West's point of view, the shadow tanker fleet is winning the war at the moment. It's moving millions of barrels of oil every single day backwards and forwards from Russia, and very few of those ships have been intercepted. And what we saw in today's video is that the latest ship that tried to be intercepted, Russia sent a fighter jet over the sea, basically as a warning shot to Estonia, saying, we will protect what is ours. And so Estonia basically let that ship go back to Russian waters. And if that's the way things are going to develop, it will be interesting to see how things shape up over the next few months. Hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it interesting, useful and informative. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and thank you so much to everyone that's supported me. If you bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thank, really appreciate that. And if you're a long-term member, either through Patreon or YouTube membership or buy me a coffee membership, thank you for that support. Really helps keep me motivated. And here's something to put a smile on your face.